Good morning, and welcome to our panel this morning on K-12 education reform. Are we getting it right? This morning we're going to have a discussion about specific steps that must take place to improve the learning environment for all students, with the goal to prepare every student so that they can be successful in a most challenging 21st century. We're fortunate this morning to have our 5 knowledgeable and opinionated panelists here on education reform. I'm going to introduce them very quickly, short introductions. You can look at your program for the longer introductions. I'd like to begin with Dr. Rudy Crew, who's sitting at the end there on the right. Rudy is president of Medgar Evers College at the City University of New York. His goal, to increase achievement for poor and minority students. This builds upon Rudy's prior roles as chancellor of the New York City Public Schools and superintendent of Miami-Dade Public Schools. John Daisy, who is sitting in the center. John has led districts from East Coast to West, from Prince George's County, Maryland, to most recently, Los Angeles Unified. Talk about a challenge. At LAUSD, he focused on graduating students bound for college and the workplace. John is now superintendent and resident at the Broad Center. Dr. Sarah Hayburn, who's sitting to John's left on our side. Sarah began as an English teacher, and then she moved on to become a policy analyst at Vanderbilt's National Center on Performance Incentives. I guess she was noticed there by the governor because she served as a K-12 policy advisor to Tennessee Governor Haslam and as Assistant Commissioner of Education. This past January, Sarah was named Executive Director for the Tennessee State Board of Education. Eva Moskowitz. Eva is founder and CEO of Success Academy Charter Schools, the highest performing charter schools in New York City. Eva launched her first school in 2006, structured according to lessons learned during visits to hundreds of schools while chair of the New York City Council Education Committee. Today, Success Academy has 32 schools demonstrating serious achievement. And Kristen Van Hook. Kristen Van Hook, Senior Vice President for Policy and Development with the National Institute for Excellence in Teaching, a nonprofit committed to ensuring effective teacher in every classroom in America. Kristen's work has proven instrumental in NIET's key initiatives, the TAP system for teacher and student advancement, and the Best Practices Center. Today, NIET is impacting more than 200,000 teachers and more than 2.5 million students in diverse schools across America. Formerly, Kristen served as Executive Director for the Partnership for 21st Century Skills, a coalition of stakeholders across business, community, and education. Now, before we begin our discussion this morning, we're going to take a very, very quick overview of the state of American K-12 education. In the past decade, the work of policymakers, educators, parents, and students has actually resulted, yes, we do have some good news, in some measurable learning gains. This can be seen in improvement in the National Assessment of Educational Progress results in both mathematics and reading. In mathematics, for example, since the passage of No Child Left Behind in 2001, the percentage of fourth graders scoring at levels of proficient or above has risen from 24% to 42%, an impressive improvement. In reading, not as impressive, but still improvement from 29% to 35%. Among 8th graders, there's also been improvements in both mathematics and in reading. In urban districts and mathematics, gains have also been realized. Over a decade period, mathematics proficiency results among urban 4th graders has increased from 16% to 32%, and among urban 8th graders from 14% to 24%. We have also seen growth in high school completion rates among all students over the past few years, with the largest gains among Black and Hispanic students. Charter school growth is continuing, though I can assure you not as fast as the demand from parents and students. Students in many urban charter schools today are seeing significant growth compared to similar students in traditional public schools. A recent study of 41 urban regions conducted by Stanford University's Center for Research on Educational Outcomes found that students in urban charter elementary schools have achievement growth that equates to 40 additional days of learning per year in math and 33 additional days in reading. And the results, as you can see, among middle school students are even more impressive. 73 days of additional learning in math and 45 days in reading. We are also seeing improvement in one area of those entering the teaching profession. A recent study in New York shows that among all schools, whether those with high poverty rates, middle poverty rates, or low poverty rate, SAT scores among individuals who become teachers has been improving in a meaningful way over the past decade. Now, while some progress is being made, we still find significant numbers of students, primarily in our urban areas and rural areas, who are still being left behind. Despite expending more than $200 billion in federal funds over the past half-century to programs directed to disadvantaged students, the most recent NAEP results for fourth graders shows that still 50% of black students and 47% of Hispanic students score at a below basic level, meaning that students are unable to read. And 34% of black students and 27% of Hispanic students still do not even have the most basic math skills. And when we look at the results in the largest school districts in our nation, we still find unacceptably high percentages of fourth grade students overall who are at below basic levels in both reading and math. And the results among eighth graders are equally distressing. So now I'd like to turn and I'll ask John first, when you reflect on your tenure as a big city chief, whether at LA Unified or the other positions you've had, tell us for a moment about the most impactful reforms that you were able to institute and whether they are still operating in the districts in which you served. And John, maybe you could just reflect on why it is so difficult to move the ball for better outcomes for large groups of students, despite the intense efforts of yourself and others in this endeavor.
Okay, we don't have enough time for that last question about why it is, and it's a family audience, so I mean, I want to, I think if we reflect on just LA, it was an astonishing 4 years. I'm beyond humbled. So almost all of the youth live in a circumstance of poverty, most of it unimaginable. No one looks like me. Nobody speaks English as their first language. That kind of diversity is an absolute gift. And we began and came in with our administration, and we began with a 4-year cohort graduation rate of 56%, and 4 years later we left and it was 83%. We were the fastest improving NAEP score big urban in America during that period of time. We took every one of the levels of achievement by our state test, when we left at the highest level in every grade and in every subject. Our suspension rates moved from 49,000 suspensions a year to 8,000 suspensions a year. So in so many ways, and in every indicator, really remarkable results for students. Not enough by any means, but absolutely remarkable in every category. We absolutely believe that that was due to a couple of pieces. One was this kind of willful, deliberate, consistent attention to criminalization of youth and pushing youth out. And so changing state law and changing policy around willful defiance as a reason for suspension, improving and putting into place restorative justice practices so that we were not complicit in a schoolhouse to prison house pipeline, absolutely saw a plummet in the number of suspensions and a huge increase in the number of graduation and achievement for those youth. That makes perfect sense. When they're with us, they do very well. And I think the focus on language learners, the transformational policies around who has the right to be in front of students, who has the right to lead schools, all of the human capital work. We completely reconceptualized how we hire and fire and promote, train, retain, place, and support teachers and administrators. There was a very, very deliberate and thoughtful work at public school choice. So when I began, we're a big system. So when I began, we had 83,000 youth in charter schools. It was 137,000 4 years later. The study you mentioned, LA in the Credo Institute at Stanford, has the highest performing charter portfolio in the nation. So we closed low-performing, non-improving charters and opened as many of the high-performing as we can. And that effect inside the system also created opportunities for pilot schools where teachers could open and develop schools, write their own contracts, et cetera. Kind of a thumbnail sketch of a very hard-working, very intense period of time. I think the focus on students' rights saw its high point in the success of the Vergara litigation emanated from LA, where really the rights of students were placed front and center for their right to stability and their right to quality in the teaching and leadership force. So we kind of thought about the reforms that worked were ones when you took them all at the same time around transforming legislation, regulation, negotiation, and litigation. Are they all still working? No. A number of them have been rolled back. A number of them have been ended. Those are decisions that policymakers will do. That's their right to make those decisions. I just hope and pray that the trajectory, which was a first in LA's history of its magnitude, does not also reverse. Students have the right to have what we have, which is a piece of this American dream, regardless of who they are, regardless of the circumstances they live in, and that is the reason we open the doors. And that does actually worry me a great deal.
Mm-hmm. Rudy, do you want to reflect for a moment on your experience in New York City and Miami-Dade, on what you believe were the most impactful reforms, and are those reforms still in place today?
I was thinking about that as John was talking, and I honestly think that, you know, some of your slides earlier that depicted the additional days of instruction or the equivalent of additional days of instruction were quite powerful. And one of the things that we did when I was chancellor was essentially to create for the lowest performing schools a sort of separate and differentiated zone in which all the rules were changed. Longer day, longer year, more professional development for teachers, more leadership development for the principals, better scrutiny and, if you will, better supervision of those principals than almost any place else in the system. Much more of a focus, if you will, on students being able to read and do math than almost any place else in the system. Big systems are unique in the fact that they require a kind of a, I would say, differentiated approach. That not all schools are the same as every other school, and thus the attention needed to manage, supervise, allocate resources, et cetera, would be very different. And in large measure, this is really for me, it's really about a focus on instruction. It's a focus on assessment. It's a focus on professional development and the development of teachers, the onboarding of new teachers, the sustainability of and getting traction of new ideas in the system. And both in Miami as well as in New York, those were ideas that really helped to overcome the inertia of the system because you had to do them fast and you had to do them quickly and, frankly, without ceremony. And it caught the system by storm in some cases because it was not used to doing things quite as differently as were being proposed or some of the things that John talked about.
As you look today, though, Rudy, what was lasting?
I think the secondary school in Miami, I would say secondary school reform where we actually connected instruction to internships and to the world of work. I would say that really almost singularly resulted in some of the real gains in high schools that we saw. And that's still there to the best of my ability. The whole notion of a parent academy, the idea that really this is not, a pipeline begins at home. And if you don't get the home and parents specifically involved, there's a huge amount of research that would suggest that that really is the bedrock of real performance and, if you will, confidence building of young people. And I think to a large degree, this notion of being able to double down on reading and math and training of teachers, that's still in play. Now, it may have a different form, a different name and all that, but I think it's still very much in play.
But both, maybe John, you could just reflect for just a moment. How do you actually keep reform efforts that appear to be, or are in fact, making progress, obviously not as fast as we'd want, but are making progress? How does that stay in effect with the changing cast of a district superintendent, changing cast of governors, and et cetera, with your governance? How does that happen?
Yeah, I think a couple of ways that that's important. One is to place those successful transformations and reforms inside of law. So changing law so that they sit there. So it's a willful act to unwind it, putting it in negotiated contracts. When families and students have a sense that their voice is powerful and matters, it's very difficult to roll that back.
But let's take something like the parent trigger in Los Angeles, right? So that was rooted in some kind of law, right?
That's correct.
Right. So, but that also now is under attack, correct?
Yeah, and so what we thought about when Parent Trigger is LA was the only place that it actually wasn't a fist fight. So we worked with the parents to provide that. I think you try to give communities and parents the notion that it is their schools and they have the right to the highest quality that white privileged schools have, and that when they can see those successes, they will own those and feel more powerful around that. But this notion of changing law and changing policy, I think that matters a lot. So when we decided to redistribute funds through a student-weighted formula, if you want to actually roll that back, you will have to say to communities, you have been historically underfunded for decades. You are now funded in the way that is just and right. We're going to take it back again. I think that is very difficult to do.
Let me stay on the topic, though, for a moment of governance, which is really a key issue. So I'd like to turn to Eva for a moment. And, you know, given the political realities and the context in which your charter schools operate, as you think about it, what is the optimum governance structure which you have in your schools, I assume with a board and so on, but what do you need from the state or the mayor or parents or unions and donors and community leaders really to enable you to be successful in what you want to do? Or what don't you want them to do to you?
Well, I would start by having a mayor who's not going to throw out the highest performing charters in the city of New York and in the state of New York. We were #1 in math in the state of New York in 5th grade, and that was the school that Mayor de Blasio decided to make homeless. Now, he didn't succeed, obviously. But look, you know, we've had pro-charter mayors. I think Mayor de Blasio will be the last anti-charter mayor in the city of New York. I think the tide has turned when you have thousands, tens of thousands of parents on wait lists asking for an alternative. I don't think the political system can turn its back on that. But, you know, the charter sector needs, you know, we call it the 3 Fs. We need facilities, funding, and we need our freedom to organize schools around teaching and learning. And that last one is often ignored. Dr. Crew was talking about the freedom to do the chancellor's district, whether you're in the district system or in the charter sector. Schooling is really in its infancy. If you think about driverless cars and all of the R&D that has gone into something like that, we have not really invested in a significant way in how you educate kids. Something as simple as what math problems should we be teaching in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade? That's something that we at Success spend an awful lot of time thinking about. What is the level of difficulty? What are the creative math problems that can be given? And you'd think there might be one book that you could just go to get the best math problems, but it's actually not the case. Collecting that intellectual property and really thinking anew about how we efficiently and effectively educate kids, that is something that requires capital. That is something that requires a pretty significant investment in. But the public policies that are preventing charter growth really have to do with the 3 Fs. We were able to win some very significant policy gains with Governor Cuomo, so that facilities funding is now provided. We were able to prevent the mayor from charging charters rent. Of course, districts don't pay for the use of public school buildings, and we made the argument that we are a public school. We're just a different kind of public school, and therefore we shouldn't pay rent. So there are public policies that can make this work even more difficult than it is, and I'm really looking forward to the day when, instead of preventing high-performing charters from growing faster, folks are rolling out the red carpet. We're trying to get to 100 in New York City. If I were mayor, I would be asking, how come you're not getting to 200? Who else can get to 100? How do we do this faster? Because although I loved your slides, Lowell, I mean, we're not really in good shape in this country by any imaginable standard. It's not only the most disadvantaged students, but if you look at our highest performing kids, we are at the bottom of the heap internationally. And whether we are motivated the way most of us on this panel are by social justice or, frankly, global competitiveness, if we don't get our act together in this country, China and India, if they haven't eaten our lunch, will do so very, very quickly. And so
I don't think anybody would dispute that, Eva. Let's take a look at chart 211 again. I showed this just a moment ago, but I think it's worth looking at it one more time, if we could bring it up. While I showed that there has been some improvement, I think just as John Daisy just said, that there has been improvement. LA Unified's had improvement, but even after the improvement, we are still facing these kind of statistics. It's shocking to think that in these large urban areas that you have as many as 50% of the students in 4th grade who scored a below basic level in reading, and 31% here in LA Unified. So we have an incredible amount of work to do. I'd like to turn our attention here for a moment to what I actually believe we need to do if we're ever going to move these numbers in any kind of meaningful way. And that is, I think we need to deal with the issue of teacher effectiveness in a very systemic way. We know from research and our own personal experiences that educator effectiveness is the single most important school-related factor that drives student performance. Can we see chart 326, please? And we know, you can see here that the difference between the top 20% of teachers in terms of student learning and the bottom 20% of teachers can be as much as 1 year's growth in student performance. We also know that the best performing educational systems in the world all focus on teacher effectiveness as the core component of their strategy and practices to propel student learning. And they believe in an axiom which I think says it all, which is the quality of an educational system cannot exceed the quality of its educators. Yet the vast majority of school districts still, particularly in our urban areas, are highly challenged because they often will have the least experienced and least effective teachers teaching the most challenging students. And we also know that teacher turnover remains high, in fact, as high as 40% during the first 5 years of teaching, and significantly greater in high-poverty schools. Now, in the past few years, the federal government has made educator evaluation and accountability one of its top priorities in K-12 education reform, and some states and districts have taken steps to make the structural changes needed to attract large numbers of talented individuals to the teaching profession and then create an environment in which they can thrive and excel. I'd like to turn our attention to, for a moment, Kristen, and I'll begin with you, where you've made educator effectiveness the cornerstone of your work at NIET for more than a decade. What has been your experience in implementing comprehensive school reform efforts and actually changing the nature by which we attract, retain, motivate, and develop the best teachers?
Thank you, Lowell. Thank you for having me today. I think one of the things we've spent a lot of time looking at and the structure underlying the TAP system and our work at NIET is really the question of why does someone want to be a teacher? What's great about being a teacher? What makes you want to stay in that profession and choose it in the first place? And many of the systems that have been put in place over the years are really a disincentive to talented people choosing and remaining in teaching. So one of the areas we've looked a lot at, and especially as it relates to policy around teaching, what are some of those structural barriers that can be changed? How can we create a system that recognizes growth, that encourages people to view this as a career where they're going to have powerful opportunities over time to develop? And so what we have done over the last 15 years is put together what we've called the TAP system. Now this is some elements that are actually very similar to approaches others have taken, but putting it all together in a comprehensive system has made a big difference. So let me just pull up slide 804 and just briefly describe to you. So what we've tried to do is to say, what are some of the key elements that are going to drive a system where people are going to want to work there and are going to improve over time? So it's really important for people to have the opportunity to take on leadership roles, and that the folks in the school with some of the greatest expertise, the teachers, are part of defining and driving toward instructional excellence. So these opportunities for new roles and responsibilities, and creating a structure of distributed leadership so that teachers are a part of these decisions. We also focus on job-embedded professional development. So in the past, professional development often was sending people out to a lecture or a conference, and not finding a way to really make the professional development timely and relevant to the problems they were facing in their classroom every day. So the concept then is to use the teacher leaders to provide that professional development at the school site. Evaluations we're going to talk more about probably later, but we found it essential to be able to have information about whether or not people are effective, and that evaluation in the past was not viewed as any kind of a useful measure. It was kind of a drive-by or a drop-in. Everybody, essentially, if we want to take a quick look at slide 343, everyone essentially was told, you're doing great. So where's the room for growth there? How do you motivate people to say, we really need to improve your skills to improve student achievement when people are being told they're at the highest rating? So if you could pull up slide 344, just briefly, this is really one of the most significant things that we've done in NIT in our work, and others we've been working with in the area of evaluation. The reason it's important is that you can see here that we have worked with schools to redefine excellence and to create room at the upper end for growth. And this looks like a normal distribution of human talent that you'd see in any organization, really. And in schools, it's so important to have a conversation around that. So the last piece, the fourth element in TAP, we spend a lot of time on is we talk about the instructional rubric. So creating a language about great instruction that gives room for growth, that gives an opportunity to say, wow, think about what you could do differently in that lesson, what you talked about, Eva, in terms of what more could you do to help that student, what different math problem, and to have others in your school working with you in a leadership team to say, let's really think about how we can move the needle for that student and how I can help you as the teacher to be successful. And just one last thought on that. I think the other thing that I have found really powerful in this work is, of course, it's challenging for those teachers who choose to go to a high-need school and work with high-need populations. They are feeling battered by all the negative coverage, your school is failing, et cetera. And yet there's so many people in that system who are wanting to see growth, wanting to succeed. And I think the opportunity to look at how they're able to actually grow students, even if the students aren't quite yet at proficiency, is very important to be able to recognize and reward that, to say, you're working with some of our highest need students. We thank you, we honor that choice, and we want to help you to be even more successful, and let's recognize that success. And I think that's one of the things that's important, to change that flow where in the past, teachers always felt like, well, I'm going to go to one of those schools where all the kids are already proficient and everyone thinks we're doing a great job. We need to find a way to get those teachers and reward them for staying in the schools that really need the highest talent and the most effective teachers, and to say, stay here, we're going to recognize and reward you, and you're going to have opportunities for career growth and collegiality amongst your team.
Thank you, Kristen. When you talk about scale in terms of bringing to bear on a system, certainly Tennessee is a vivid example of that. They've experienced remarkable statewide improvements in student achievement over the past few years. Can we see chart 246? Here are the results from the National Assessment of Educational Progress over the period from 2011 to 2013. I think you can see clearly that Tennessee had 50% more growth over this 2-year period than any other state. And if we look at 247, this was Tennessee's increase in student growth from 2011 to 13. But the key point here is that in all of the years that NAEP has been doing assessments, this is the largest growth by a state in history. So it's very impressive. Sarah, you were at the forefront of the whole effort in Tennessee, beginning, I guess, in 2010 in the development and the subsequent implementation of evaluation system. And we know from your experience, and you told us a little bit about this yesterday at lunch, that initially there was a fair amount of resistance among education leaders and many educators in the state to moving over to a new rigorous evaluation system. So maybe if you could take a moment, comment upon what's happened since that initial resistance, and what are you doing to build on your initial efforts to really extend and even realize greater gains?
Certainly, thank you. It's been an interesting journey in Tennessee, to say the least, and I've been fortunate to be there from the beginning of our Race to the Top grant to today, and it's been about 5 years since we started some of these reforms. And I think stepping back just a minute before I tell you a little bit about the evaluation story in Tennessee, I mean, I think in hearing all my colleagues up here on the panel, it really is, at its core, teaching is about a teacher connecting with students. And I think if we get that piece right in the classrooms across our state and across the nation, then we go a long way towards seeing results that we can be proud of for students that give them real opportunities in life. But if we ignore what's happening in our classrooms and we pretend that we can change the desks and move the curriculum and play with the other sort of elements in the system, but not give real attention to teachers and the supports they need to do instruction well for students every day in every classroom, then we're never going to see the kind of results that we need to be globally competitive. So in Tennessee, we focused on that from the beginning of this reform work and said, you know, our bargain is that if we think about teaching and learning as the teacher and the students being the nucleus of our system, then let's start with that and build from there. And that meant getting serious about teacher performance. It's hard to support teachers if you don't know how they're doing in the classroom and what instruction looks like from classroom to classroom. And so really thinking about sort of that left cornerstone of the TAP system as our first step as a state in terms of scaling reform work that we thought would really drill down to teacher effectiveness. And that meant giving teachers feedback on their performance regularly, using a common language through the TAP rubric, which we were fortunate enough to partner with NIET to get their support and use their resources early on to do training at scale of evaluators that first summer. We trained over 7,000 evaluators on the TAP rubric in 4-day trainings that culminated in an assessment, you know, to see whether when they watched lessons, if they could norm against this rubric and really understand deeply what high instruction, when done well, looked like. And then go out in classrooms and actually put that into play. And that first year, as Lowell knows, and many of you, if you were paying attention at all back in 2011-12 school year, it was loud. Again, I heard some folks say, I mean, this is, change is hard in any industry. I think in education, it's excruciating sometimes because we don't do enough of it often. And so that first year was really difficult. We had changed the name of the game for principals, first and foremost. Their job description fundamentally turned on a dime from being about buses and ball games and sort of some of those traditional responsibilities to really being forced to be in classrooms, because all of our teachers, under a law that was passed in a special session ahead of the Race to the Top grant, required every teacher to be evaluated every year, and that meant multiple observations for every teacher in our system. So again, that first year was difficult. The governor stepped in and said, you know, we're going to not roll this law back mid-year, you know, because the legislature was threatening to do that. Teachers were upset, principals were not sure what they were doing, looking for help wherever they could find it, and said, we're going to listen. So we did some significant listening tours. We partnered with different groups within the state to make sure we could really get out and hear from teachers, hear from educators, find out what was working, find out what needed to be changed in the system. Because we said from the beginning, evaluation systems, no evaluation system is perfect. We're going to be about continuous improvement in this system, just as much as the system is designed for continuous improvement in the classroom. So after that first year, doing a lot of listening, taking a lot of blows, we put out a first-year report that really tried to reflect back to the public and to our educators what we'd heard and what changes we were going to make to the system based on what we were hearing. And then we did that. We made those changes. And about that time, our student results came in, and they were, we saw the most growth that we'd ever seen in our state tests. And then the NAEP results came back, and similarly, as you saw, we saw some significant growth. And this was with our existing teacher population. You know, this was about giving the teachers that we had in the system more feedback and more of a sense of what the common language around effective instruction should look like, and really breaking down those barriers that often exist in terms of the siloed classroom experience. So since then, it's been, again, an interesting journey. We've focused the conversation, and it shifted pretty quickly after that first year about whether or not to do evaluation to how to do it better. And that was a pretty fundamental shift, not if we do it, but how we do it. And so we've been working with teachers to build out additional growth measures that we feel show something significant about impact on student learning. We've been looking at student surveys as another element that really capture the student voice and the student perspective. They're in the classroom day in and day out and can tell us some really important things about what's happening in terms of rigor and challenge. And so really trying to refine our system so that the data that we're generating through the evaluation system can then in turn affect a lot of the other initiatives that we want to take on as a state to continue to see this growth. Because let's be honest, we've made growth, but we are still in the bottom half of states in Tennessee, and we're not content with that. So thinking about teacher prep and how do we reflect data back to them so that we know which institutions are getting it right and have the right blueprint for teacher success and teacher preparation. Compensation systems and teacher leadership, I mean, all of those are driven by having data that you feel like is telling you something real about teacher performance. So really starting with that and then building from our evaluation system has been important to the progress we've seen.
Well, Tennessee obviously benefited from getting the Race to the Top grant, as you just indicated, that really helped propel this whole thing, but also made it a requirement as part of the Race to the Top, the teacher effectiveness piece and so on. So let's turn our attention just for a moment to the federal government. Can we see slide 402, please? So you can see in 402 that in actuality, the federal government really plays a rather minimal role in terms of overall funding in about a $700 billion industry. So it's maybe doing about 10%, give or take. It may vary year by year. And for years, the government, a lot of the money obviously, goes into Title I and Title II funds and so on, which are distributed in states and down to districts and schools. But in the past decade in particular, the U.S. Department of Education has used competitive grants really to a degree we really haven't seen in the past to really try to drive effective education reform. Obviously, the whole issue about having higher standards to normalize expectations between states and districts, some of you may have heard it used to be called Common Core, has run into some political difficulties today and so on. But I'd like to just ask our panelists, when you talk about the federal government and the role the federal government could play in helping you drive education reform in your respective positions, what do you want the federal government to do with you, for you? And maybe you could also comment whether you were a beneficiary of some of these competitive grants, and did they actually have an impact? John, do you want to comment on that for a moment?
I sure do. I just, at some point, I do want to make a point. I'd like to go back to the teacher effectiveness piece.
Go ahead.
Just for 1 second.
Right.
So I think it's amazing the vitriol and the ad hominem attack and the kind of deep fight that has taken place over this. And I'll just use California as an example, but certainly across this country. I mean, the notion of just portraying the fact that students have the right to have the most effective teacher in front of them is anti-union, is very hard for me to comprehend. So the fact that it took in California a lawsuit by students to say that the policies about removing low-performing and moral behaving individuals and keeping the most effective and the policies and how they're implemented in California, as the judge described them in his decision, shocked the conscience of anybody who would watch this. And so, of course, he found them all unconstitutional. And yet we still can't even find the simplest way of saying to a teacher who's doing a phenomenal job, I'm sorry, when it comes time to make a seniority-based decision for which they're all over in law or in contract, I can do nothing and include nothing about actually how you do your job. It has to be the day that you got your job. Because the belief somehow is that it is completely objective to use the date of hire. If we want to go down that road, I just think it's so much easier to just line the teachers up and say, fire the short ones. Height is completely objective, and it is completely as ridiculous as you would use anything else. You would want to take a look at this. But this notion that wanting to provide teachers with the conditions of autonomy, because they know so well their craft and their knowledge, and the conditions for which people who are doing a phenomenal job, particularly in the most impacted places, can be kept, is something that I just didn't want us to think that this was anywhere near settled, because we have one phenomenal example in one state. Back to our federal government for a second. California was unable to get a race to the top. They tried 3 times. Wouldn't include the provisions that were part of the competitive piece. So a group of 10 districts came together and wrote for it ourselves, and we got it. LA was one of those, and basically got the waiver through Race to the Top and the opportunities to do this work. Pretty amazing work took place around that. I want the government to be able to say, what are the types of standards that would make us competitive internationally and nationally, and why in California, Mississippi, or Maine, algebra should look differently in all those 3 states, and how crazy that would be for students. So I want them to be able to help identify what is rigorous, what is good. I want them to have a strong Office of Civil Rights, which I think has also been a piece that is not looked at clearly, so that when disproportionality and outright policies affect students, but particularly youth of color and youth who live in a circumstance of poverty, disproportionately hurt those, we're not going to sit by and watch that anymore, just kind of hope you change around those pieces. A very strong enforcement piece around that. And also definitely as they have done, which is to say, these are practices that we strongly urge you to consider if you want this money. If you don't want the money, don't do it on your own. But to make very public the need of supporting great teaching, supporting students, and honoring the success when that happens. So that is, I think, an incredibly important role for a very limited chunk of money.
I happen to be a believer that the federal government can play a very key role in stimulating innovation. Mm-hmm. I think that No Child Left Behind, which has been attacked, in a whole range of different ways, and the issue of having it geared toward absolute levels rather than value-added growth, I think was a mistake in its structure. But the basic concept of the law, that we are going to look at every single group, every single student, I think is partly responsible for the movement we showed earlier. When you see the improvements in the number of students who were proficient, you can see that it really started to accelerate with No Child Left Behind. And I also am a strong believer that the competitive grants, whether Race to the Top, the Teacher Incentive Fund, the innovation things, do stimulate change in a system that historically has been resistant to change. Rudy, if you could envision the perfect world for the role for the federal government, what are your comments? What are your thoughts about the competitive grants? Do you feel that that has been a stimulation for change? Do you think there's another role that the federal government should be playing in a industry that historically is really state and local by its operation?
I've thought about this issue for a long time and watched as a lot of the competitive money was being put out there. Frankly, I was unimpressed by it. It came with such complication that districts were running around avoiding the bottom as opposed to chasing the top. And many were frankly trying to figure out how to balance local budgets against new dollars that were coming in and so on and so forth. So I think that the place where the federal government actually has an enormously powerful role, one of them you mentioned is around innovation. I think that this represents new money. It represents money that is not already spoken to in a way that is absorbed by the cookie monster. And I think that it enables people to think differently. However, the second area where I think that they have fallen, in my mind, is around real technical support for what does innovation really mean and how does it impact instruction, and how would you now begin to integrate that into the instructional conversation of a state or a local district. So the technology conversation, for example, is one that I think needs some support and a context in which what teachers are trying to do and how they're thinking about it from a totally instructional point of view, as well as the assessments needed for that. That needs to marry the conversation about technology. But those conversations are happening in totally separate places right now. And so to the degree that the government has a way of thinking about its position in the public educational sphere, it should position itself as a convener around these issues of how instruction is improved and how teaching can actually be improved by the use of technology, where there are hybrids, if you will, of models that could be formed. The government ought to help to spearhead that. And the last part I would say is I do think this issue of counting, keeping score, the government's got to keep score. I mean, I think that this is you know, we're watching Baltimore, we're watching Ferguson, we're watching a country that is in many ways dismantled over these issues, that they're embedded in a classroom somewhere. They're embedded in the disproportionality of failure. They're embedded in this poor distribution of good education versus bad education. The bell curve that was shown here a minute ago doesn't really look like that in many places across the country. So to the degree that we see the federal government having a voice and being willing to step into that place, they should step into that place where we see this sliding off the sort of beyond the tipping point kind of question, and districts beginning to kind of really get out of reach in disproportionate numbers of kids who are failing, disproportionate numbers of kids who are coming in and actually not graduating, and so on and so forth. I think they've got a natural role in being able to speak to that.
Eva, is there any role that you see for the federal government in your efforts from a public policy point of view or otherwise? Have you ever sought out a competitive grant? Do you believe that you could qualify for a competitive grant for the efforts you're trying to do to really transform thousands and thousands of the educational experience of students in New York?
Yes, we have been the beneficiaries of federal CSP funding and startup grants. You know, local governments do not provide startup funds. They do for district schools, but not for charters, and so we would not have been able to grow from 0 to 32 in 9 years, serving next year 11,000 kids without federal startup dollars. And we are hopeful in the reauthorization of ESEA that high-performing charters will be eligible for startup grant money.
Well,
Sarah?
I think there's also a role for the federal government to say, in the vein that Rudy was saying, that when we find either lowest performing or greatest disproportionality, you must do something about that.
Right.
And you know, I leave that to the wisdom of what that would be. But you just knowing that 25% of the schools where the highest concentration of students in poverty go to are so vastly underperforming, and just announcing that is not enough. So I think the government must then say, and you will intervene.
Right, but what can the federal government really do in that mode other than withhold funds? Because what real power does it have other than to withhold funds?
Well, I actually think Rudy was on to something about the power of convening and giving us practice,
Yeah,
and providing us with a place to understand how to do this better.
Yeah, there's you know, I don't want to turn, you know, the notion of Big Brother into something real, but I do think that it's important for people in the federal government, as John said, to not just announce bad numbers, but to actually take some affirmative step toward intervening in the practice.
Right.
And literally saying, through the work of NIT and a whole host of other people, where the models do exist, that we will invoke that into your conversation. And we are going to avail your district of all of the best practice that we think could benefit your and you need to select that. So you need to, this is not a question of, choice, right? You need to select which of these strategies you're going to actually embrace. We'll help you do that, but we are not going to allow you, the absence of your commitment is not going to be a reason we allow these young people to go through the next decade of their educational lives and fail.
Precisely.
What I worry about, to be perfectly honest with you, is that the conversation about this ultimately becomes a conversation about money. And it's just about how much money can I get from the federal government, and so on and so forth. So we all scurry around trying to figure out, well, what do we have to say, to the Grand Master to get him to dance for us? You know what I mean? So you try to figure. I'm saying that is a secondary, for me, that's a secondary role. I've never been in really low-performing schools that didn't have enough money to change it, right? I've been in low-performing schools that didn't have enough ideas, didn't have enough strategies, didn't have enough support for teachers, didn't have the human capital, but they didn't have, it wasn't an absence of money. In many cases, what they had was enough money to make all the wrong decisions twice.
Well, if I could just jump in really briefly. I think one of the things, too, about the competitive grants, and we found this in the Teacher Incentive Fund grant, is this requirement that you look for a model or an outside partner, your choice,
Right.
but that you can bring in some expertise and that it isn't all about reinventing the wheel every single time. Gee, let's start from scratch and create an instructional rubric and describe good teaching. I mean, that's been done.
Right.
So what pieces can you bring in and how can you use partners in a way and then hold people accountable for the results, as you were saying, it's you choose your method, but you've got to be able to show that you're making progress. And I think one of the things that's been impressive about some of the conversations around the competitive grants is when it does get to the conversation about how can we reach for something higher, and it gets away from that minimal, gee, how do I meet the floor, which has always been the conversation in the formula fund. So how can we continue to encourage that? What do we put in there? And I think we've found that being a partner and being able to come in and push hard and bring in outside examples, take people and say, you're saying this can't happen here. Well, come over to this school in this other state and we're going to show you, and you can sit down with those teachers, so that somebody who has the ability to help kind of pull together some of that expertise, not all within us, of course, but the schools we're working with, and to connect people and say, and then to use technology you had talked about, to create a portal, to create resources where you can say, look, here's an idea, someone's working on math, here's something they found that was very successful with these particular students and teachers, and you can look at that in a way that is not just searching the internet and hoping you'll find something, but it's structured and provided to you in a way that's useful.
Right.
Well, you had asked also what there are other things. I know the government's very busy, but I would like to place one other thing square and center is to continue to strengthen their voice and activity around the standards of practice for the improvement of teacher preparation. I mean, this notion of teacher preparation is so critical and vital, and I would encourage that to continue and grow and strengthen.
Well, John, how many teachers did you have in LA Unified at your peak?
38,000.
So when you talk about the pipeline of those teachers, let's talk about the schools of ed for a moment. Mm-hmm. What do you want the schools of ed? What could the schools of ed do for you if they were?
Change. Talk about changing it as you.
Yeah. So I think there's also this notion of being very public about where students are succeeding with which teachers coming from which institutions, like not shying away from that. Like we've stopped shying away from who's suspending young black boys. So let's just talk about that and then do something about that. Same notion around that piece. Second of all is really being clear about that this is, like when I walk EVA schools, like I want teachers who can teach like that and get those results, which is a very, very willful notion of developing a set of practices. And that just doesn't come from a methods class, and then maybe take a few reading courses. So the idea that if we want a very deep customized sense of this is a skill set and a knowledge base that is as precise and as rigorous as medicine.
Right.
And then the third thing is I don't want them to be the cash cow for the research institutions. So that the notion that we can be more selective and more critical in terms of having who is getting in and what they are learning and what they are needed in terms of support when they come back into a district is a conversation that I would really argue should be front and center.
Sarah, do you want to comment? Because I think it's very important for you to explain in Tennessee what you're doing with the schools of ed in connection with your rubrics and the whole evaluation thing, how you're tying that together.
Yeah, I have thoughts about the federal government too, but we'll come back to that. Okay. No, I mean, listen, and it's hard to imagine any of these changes and any of these conversations, and whether it's the federal government or the state, really holding accountable the players in the system if you don't have teacher performance data that's credible. You know, you can't make real and lasting change in teacher prep if you don't have data to say this institution, and again, it's got to be more than just how long our teachers are staying from that institution in these given districts, but how are they performing in the first year, in the second year, in the third year? You know, and we've got to have systems that take that seriously. And so I do think, back to the federal government, one of the things they've allowed us to do through the Race to the Top funds was to have some cover and push for that policy and legislative change that required that. I wish they'd held the line a little longer on other states, because I think we've got to have peer states who are moving in that direction as well, so that as we think about the state role with districts, it's not unlike the federal role with states. You have to have a critical mass of players who are making these key changes and getting results so that the system then is self-sustaining. Because I fear, you know, we've got these pockets of change that are showing real results, whether it's some of our innovative charter networks or districts or states, but they can't stay there alone on the edge of this work. We've got to have others coming along with us. And I do think a lot of it roots into having data that's credible, and that really does start at the student level and the teacher level.
Can we see slide, I think it's 358 for a moment? I hope it's 358. So I just want to make one comment that it is interesting that it looks like that younger teachers are far more willing to accept the accountability piece, the evaluation piece, the observation piece, as a means to improving their practices. They see it as an extension of their professional development. I thought this was quite an interesting study. I see that we only have a few minutes left, so I'd like to end maybe with the following comment to each one, if we could just go around. So in the audience today, we have business people, we have community leaders, we have education leaders, we have foundation members, and so on. What is your advice to them of how they could help propel change in our most challenging schools? John, when you think about you mentioned parents before, but let's talk about even the broader audience of the community leaders and business leaders. What do you think are some of the most effective ways their voice could be heard to affect change?
Yeah, start talking about governance. Who is the policy leaders of the system who choose exactly how this is going to work? I mean, governance is a phenomenally important issue, and it is, in my opinion, structured by far large in a way not to work for students around that. And we are always worried about like who's voting and how we're making those decisions. That's just wholly absent in most large urban districts around that piece. And the second piece is not being afraid to stand up and say, this is what it takes to be employed as an entry-level employee, and I want those youth in the system, so I'm willing to do internships and open the door for this piece if you are willing to be bold and courageous enough to have the systems in place so they'll be trained for that.
Mm-hmm. Eva?
Well, I would sort of avoid tinkering at the margins. It could take us another couple of centuries at the rate we're going. And if we are not bolder and do not go faster and dig deeper, we are just going to have profound, even more profound injustice in terms of educational access than we already have. And I do think we're also looking at a tremendous cost to global competitiveness. Income inequality is getting worse and worse, and education is a key driver of that. And so, you know, it is as much trouble to tinker with the system as it is to have bold change. And so you might as well go for it, because God knows the kids need it.
Kristen, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I think I guess I would say a lot of people in this audience have expertise in other sectors. And I think that's so valuable when you come in and you're talking about education and you say, how do you evaluate your employees? How do you identify talent and promote talent? To ask those questions, to ask school districts and people that you interact with, how do you evaluate your employees? How do you know how they're performing? How do you support them? How do you know how they're distributed? How many of them are teaching in the high-need classrooms, and what results do you see? And I think you all have a strong voice in that, given your expertise outside of education, to bring that perspective in.
Sarah?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think the business community in particular is uniquely positioned to support this work and to demand, as John was saying, that it's rigorous standards, whether it's, Common Core standards or teacher evaluation or whatever the politically sensitive issue of the day is. If you believe that it's going to drive change in the system, you're positioned, I think, to be effective in those conversations when it gets loud in the state houses or in the federal conversation. And I think to have confidence in sort of weighing in on one side of the issue really requires that we all get out in schools. I mean, I think the rhetoric can mask the reality so often in these issues. And to get into schools, both the high-performing and low-performing schools, and see what's working and what's not, the good, bad, and the ugly, and then empower yourself to be part of the conversation that demands higher standards and change.
And Rudy, you want to wrap it up?
Change the conversation from supply to demand. This is not about can you add more money, time, whatever it is, but the business community is uniquely positioned to actually create a demand-based conversation about public education.
I think our time's up. Thank you very much to all of our panelists.
Oh, thanks.